economic event of the year, the India Economic Conclave, is set for a blockbuster opening tomorrow from Nouriel Rubini to Joseph Stiglitz. Top policymakers to top men in the Indian industry, all in attendance in this two-day power-packed event. Good evening. This is a very special edition of the India Development Debate right here on ET Now. I'm Supriya Srinath, and tonight we will put the focus on the India Economic Conclave. Yes, indeed, India, which is aspiring to be a $10 trillion economy by 2030, has to focus on many deliverables, and that's exactly what we have in mind, and which is why the Times Network is putting together an actionable business intelligence agenda for policymakers and members of Indian and global industry to take cues from. India, which is said to be the fastest growing economy in the world, has a lot of growth disruptors. The farming sector is in distress. There isn't much private investment that's happening. There's a world that's looking increasingly insular. Globalization doesn't seem to be a favorite word for most of the developed world. India has, of course, set its sight on big-ticket reforms. Breaking into the top 50 club as far as the ease of doing business is concerned are all ambitious bets that the Indian government is looking to make. So we've got a unique thought leadership platform in the form of the India Economic Conclave. In its fourth edition this year, it's gotten even bigger. From the biggest and the best names from the world of policy making to corporates, both from India and overseas, and thought leaders from a Nouriel Rubini to a Joseph Stiglitz. The curtains will go up on the India Economic Conclave, and tonight we put the spotlight on precisely that, an agenda for actionable business intelligence. And over the next 1 hour, I will discuss exactly that with a very eminent panel right here with me. I've got Meera Sanyal joining us right here, Naushad Forbes, Rashesh Shah, Anant Narayan and Ruben Abraham. So thank you each one of you for taking time out and being with us on this very special edition of the India Development Debate. And Meera Sanyal, if I may actually begin with you, there's a lot of hope when the Modi government came to power in 2014. They have unleashed a whole host of reforms there. Somewhat tough reforms were in the making for many years. Now, while India does remain one of the fastest growing economies in the world, we've been called the sweetest, the brightest, the ocean of hope by many others. We perhaps need to focus on certain very key things because our ambitious bet is to turn into a $10 trillion economy by 2030. What should be the focus areas to get to that point?
So let me start, I think, on an optimistic note. There are many strengths we have in India, and they are talked about quite often, particularly our demographic dividend and the huge size of the economy, etc. But I will point out three things which I think are very intrinsic strengths, and if we focus on those, I think India really has the opportunity to transcend its problems and the challenges we currently face, because those are quite large, as we know. I think the first thing is that this is a country with a large propensity to save. Indians like to save, and for any growing economy to make that leap into the future, you need a high savings rate, which also translates into a high investment rate. So while at the moment we do have a high savings rate, I think we need a lot of policy measures to simplify the environment such that entrepreneurs can take this capital which is saved and turn it into productive investment. There are a lot of barriers to doing business in India, and that needs to be removed. But the high propensity to save is a great advantage we have. The second thing is the high propensity towards education. There isn't an Indian family, rich or poor, who will not save everything they have to put their children through school or college or through higher education. And this is a great asset, because with our tremendously large population, if we can skill them appropriately for the challenges of the 21st century, then India has an unbeatable advantage. And the third thing, which I think some of your economists will probably talk about at the conclave, is what Nassim Taleb called the ability to deal with disorder and chaos. And while typically we may not consider that an advantage, the world is increasingly going to be a fragile world where things are changing, where there are black swan events, where there are unknown unknowns, and Indians basically perhaps because our environment is so chaotic, are good at dealing with this. And that will be a big competitive advantage in the future. Now, if we put all of this together and we then do what we can to make it easier for Indians to educate their children, to do business, to capture the world, then it will be a better place. But I will say that as we unleash reforms, we should take small steps and make small errors. These big bang steps like demonetization have the absolute possibility of derailing a very, very well functioning economy.
Right. No, I couldn't agree with you more there, and I completely agree with you on the disorder and the chaos that perhaps the world is seeing and the many black swan events that are happening. But just to take the conversation forward on what you mentioned, private investment, and that doesn't seem to be happening. Ruben Abraham, coming to you, as far as ease of doing business is concerned, Ms. Sanyal did make a mention of that. We've seen a good jump. We've seen a jump in our position of ease of doing business, and I'm sure that's a morale booster. What will you say is making Indian industry still shy away from making fresh investments? Why is investment not breaking ground, and what has to be done to make that a reality? Because without that virtuous cycle, not much is going to be put in motion. We can keep doing these discussions, but without private investment, everything's worth nothing.
Sure. So let's just stick to the ease of doing business question for a second before we get to private investment, which frankly is actually better answered by the others on the panel. But the ease of doing business question, the World Bank's index, which is a global index, there's some shortcomings that we need to understand at the get-go. So first of all, when they rank India, they're really only talking about Mumbai and Delhi. Second, they're not actually asking firms. They're actually asking experts, and they're asking government whether it's easy to do business. And in my opinion, the only people that you should really be asking are firms. And number three, it's a composite index. So they are actually mixing up small and large firms, services firms, manufacturing firms, etc. And so what you end up getting is actually a not so nuanced picture of what is going on in Mumbai and Delhi. So we should not actually pay too much attention to just the doing business index and actually focus on improving the reality in the entire country, not just in Mumbai and Delhi, right? So that's one key thing to remember here. The other problem is because of this overfocus on the ease of doing business index, etc., and also it appears to me like one of the ways in which we think we can make it easier to do business. No doubt there's some truth to it, which is to move things online, right? That seems to be the preferred strategy. The question you've got to really ask here is, how did Singapore get to be a great place to do business before the internet, right? And I think that's the question that we're not actually asking, which is one needs to actually focus on slashing through the regulations, slashing through some of the stuff that actually makes it really, really hard to do business in India. So moving a cumbersome 40-page document online does not actually help firms. What you actually need to do is dramatically reduce the barriers to entry and the barriers and the market friction. I think you need to take that away. And I think if the government actually focused on that rather than, things like the ease of doing business index, in my mind, are more cosmetic. It obviously helps, and it obviously manages perception. But I think the reality that firms face on the ground, especially the smaller firms, needs to be squarely addressed.
No, I think you make a very valid point there that ease of doing business perhaps has to move away from the cosmetic changes of taking forms online and all of that to really making meaningful changes, especially for the smaller firms. But Rashesh Shah, coming to you on exactly that point, we have a very ambitious tall order that we want to achieve, which is to be in the top 50 club as far as ease of doing business is concerned. My question really is, how do we do that, and how do we ensure it's not just restricted, like Ruben Abraham made a mention of, not just restricted to Delhi and Mumbai, but spread all across India? I mean, perhaps to the hinterland, perhaps impact the small companies, the medium-sized companies that Ruben is talking about.
I think ease of doing business is about 3 or 4 aspects. India has obviously come a long way. We have improved our ranking quite a bit. I think the one will be your tax administration. The more your tax administration becomes efficient, goes online, becomes more transparent, more free of any coercion, I think it will help in the ease of doing business ranking for India for sure. Government is already taking quite a few steps like e-assessment and all that, and I think those things will help it quite a bit. The second is the governance at the state level and at the municipality level, because those also have a big impact on ease of doing business. So like for example, if all the municipal corporations made all your local tax filing, local property registration and all online and made it very transparent, like a few states have already been able to do. I believe Hyderabad has done a very good job at that. If we get that done, our ease of doing business will also improve. So I think good governance at state and municipal corporation level will also drive this. The third, as I said, reforms of land, labor and capital and financial sector will also improve the ease of doing business, will improve the ranks, because access to the inputs, whether it's land, whether it's labor, whether it's capital, should become more and more free and more fluid for people, so that the right entrepreneurs, the right companies get the right amount of resources to build businesses and create value for the society as a whole.
Okay, Dr. Naushad Forbes, thanks very much for being with us on the show. And just before we spoke about ease of doing business, we did mention private investment, and that seems to be this big albatross around the government's neck. While we're trying to put the house in order, it is private investment that is obviously not breaking ground. The big private investment is not breaking ground. It's not taking shape. I'm sure, the jump on the ease of doing business list is a morale booster. But why is Indian industry shying away from private investment? And when will that virtuous cycle be put into motion? What more needs to be done?
So if you look at private investment has indeed been very depressed now for many years, indeed for about 5 years. And we've not seen any recovery in private investment in this period of time. The single cause is demand. Unless we see adequate demand growth sustained over a long enough period of time, private investment is not going to come in to create new capacity. So what we've seen in the last 5 or 6 months now, probably is actually a little longer, maybe since August, so more like about 7 or 8 months, is a recovery in demand growth. Demand growth was deeply affected by demonetization in particular, and that then set the recovery of the economy and the recovery of demand back by a period of time. As we've seen it recover over these last 7 or 8 months, if it sustains for the next 5-6 months, I think then we can look forward to a turn in the investment cycle too. But it will depend entirely on demand, and demand, I think, needs to sustain the growth that we've seen in these last 6-8 months, needs to sustain for another 6 months before enough capacity gets absorbed such that companies start investing in creating fresh capacity.
Fair point indeed. I want to turn the focus and talk to all of you about infrastructure, because that's the other big theme that we are looking to address at the India Economic Conclave that begins tomorrow. And, reimagining infrastructure is something that we want to specifically talk about. Anand Narayan, coming to you. Infrastructure, of course, has been a missing link. The government has tried to bridge that deficit, but it is a gaping hole as far as Indian infrastructure is concerned. Obviously, it's time to reimagine infrastructure here in India. What do you believe are the out-of-box ideas that one should deliberate upon, that one should really look at as far as reimagining Indian infrastructure is concerned? Anand Narayan.
Yeah, look, Supriya, I think one of the slogans of Prime Minister Modi, which I really liked when he came into power, was about minimum government and maximum governance. And I think that sort of captures the essence of what probably the country needs going forward to achieve what you mentioned as a 10 trillion target, which is extremely steep, by the way, of GDP by 2030. Essentially, there is a need for minimum government investments into certain sectors. Things like education, things like healthcare, things like nutrition. These are, by the way, infrastructure as well. Skilling. These are all infrastructure as well, where probably only the government right now is equipped to put in some investments, and there is absolutely a requirement for capacity to be built up as well. There are some areas where government does not need to be there, and we can talk about that separately. At the same time, the government also needs to work on governance to ensure, as Meera was mentioning earlier,
that the conditions are created for what is a very talented, hardworking population to deliver on its potential. That means actually getting the rule of law in place, actually improving the ease of doing business, getting clean, quick justice and improving the justice system. So that's the second big important part which the government has to do. If it was to focus on these two areas of infrastructure which probably the private sector cannot help in right now, specifically education, nutrition and healthcare, that can give a big boost to demand, as the previous speaker mentioned, which can then help spur private sector enterprise into the rest of capacity building as and when demand picks up. I think that's the magic mantra that we probably have to reach out for. The model which China used to grow the last 3 decades was one of a practically centralized economy where Beijing was pretty much calling the shots on what needs to happen where. I don't think that model really will work in the Indian context. We are a reasonably strong population. We, instead of North Bloc trying to solve the country's problems, we've got to empower the people to try and come up with their own solutions. But the basic infra of education, healthcare and nutrition, and a governance structure which is reliable, which allows people to do an honest, grow an honest business, is absolutely what the government should work on. Now, Meera also mentioned that things like education actually is a demographic strength for us, but some of the statistics are really shocking even today. When we talk about 30% of the Indian children under 5 still being malnourished, when we still talk about the average 15-year-old child in even a progressive state like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, would only form a part of the bottom 5% of a class in the US. The state of our children are really, really not good as things stand. And I think that's an area which we need to focus on. We're not going to grow dramatically with some magic wand over the next 5 years. It's going to happen over the next 15 years. And to me, that basic part of infrastructure, which is education, nutrition, healthcare, followed by a governance reform, is what we need.
Fair point indeed. So those are, of course, social sectors, things that we are also talking about at the conclave. We have an entire section dedicated to skill development and to sanitation and to education. So just to tell our viewers here that we'll be beaming live all day tomorrow with the India Economic Conclave. But Meera Sanyal, coming back to you, and we have to talk about these trade wars that the world is perhaps going to potentially witness. No economy has clocked high levels of growth without its export picking up. Now, given the trade wars that we are seeing between two powerful trade blocs in the world, which is US and China, how will things really play out for India? For our own growth to be meaningful, we are expecting to grow at 15% growth rate in exports. What should our strategy then be? Should we be a spectator, wait and watch for things to unfold? Should we be joining a trade bloc? How do we best insulate ourselves if we do see a potentially full-blown trade war that the world is likely to witness?
Well, I think certainly what we are seeing is a change in balance of power, and I think that is what is probably leading to the trade wars. For a long period of time, shall we say, the developed world proposed globalization and low trade barriers because they were the exporters. And with the rise of China and the shifting in trade balance, I think the tables are turning a little bit. What is absolutely clear is that he who pays the piper calls the tune. So it is if you have the economic power, you will determine how the balance of trade is going to be and who and where you're going to put up the tariffs. So it's no surprise that we are witnessing trade wars, because the balance of power is changing within the great powers of the world. The question is, what does India want and how do we intend to play the game? And I think the points which have been made by Anant and Ruben are absolutely spot on. Before we think of how we are going to tackle trade wars by other countries, let's set our own home in order. Let's make it easier for Indians to do business in India. That is the real problem. We have seen it in every sphere of life, that Indians, when they go abroad, our non-resident diaspora, they succeed under the most hostile conditions in every country on the planet. The question is, why are they not able to succeed in that way in India? And so if we set the conditions right in India, they will not only create that investment growth that we are looking at, they will not only create new products to spur the demand that Naushad was talking about, they will also export. But the point that Anand made, which was the Prime Minister's promise of minimum government, maximum governance has not materialized. We see that in every sphere of life. The rule of law, which again Anand and Ruben talked about, is exceedingly important. Today, it is by it's almost easy to say that we have thousands and thousands of laws, but very little natural justice in this country. The institutions which we have set up to provide a level playing field, whether it is the Election Commission, whether it is the Reserve Bank of India, whether it is the CBI, all of them have been shackled. And so if you do not have strong institutions, if you do not have enabling policy framework, if you do not have the rule of law, if you do not have judiciary, if you do not have simpler policies and less paperwork, you are going to have an environment where entrepreneurship cannot thrive. And that will automatically mean fewer exports, fewer local demand, all of that. It is a cycle in and of itself. And the other thing I would like to say, which is what Rashesh Bhai said, is very important. We need more decentralization. India is a very, very big country. Ruling from the center is not going to work. And even though this government has the brute majority in parliament and now overwhelming majority in states, they are not allowing opposition states to function effectively. Delhi is a case in point. You can't do this if you want the country to flourish.
Fair point. Ms. Sanyal, I do have political towards the end of the discussion, and I promise I'm going to take a lot of them with you. But Rashesh Shah, just to take the discussion forward, and Ms. Sanyal is right that you've got to put your house in order. Why is it that this hostile environment overseas, but our own house is not in order and institutions need to be empowered? Just to take the point forward on what the narrative is, that there is a possible trade war that the world is seeing. How best should India protect itself, and at the same time, how do we ensure robust growth for our exports? Just to go back to the moot question there, Mr. Shah.
I think some amount of our exports will get affected, but don't forget that India is a very small player globally in the export market. That has been the problem. But in a trade war scenario, it's also a good thing because we won't get too hurt by these global trade wars. And the trade wars are going on are mainly on the manufacturing side. A lot of India's exports are in pharmaceuticals and are in IT services and all, which we are hoping will not get caught in this crossfire of global trade war. So I think a lot of this is going to be around steel and automobiles and all, where anyway India is not a big exporter. And I think what is smart thing to do for India is to not get caught up in this trade war, which is mainly between the USA and China, and try and stay out of it and actually get benefit out of that. One of the other thing India is doing is establishing India's leadership at the WTO, because in this trade war environment, WTO becomes a very important player in arbitrating, in mediating all this. And India has of late taken a very corrective step of becoming one of the leaders, one of the spokesperson at WTO, and making sure that WTO is an effective balancing force in this global trade war that is about to break out.
Okay. I just want to turn focus and talk to all of you about the collateral damages of the big bank loot. And Naushad Forbes, coming to you, just when we thought that the economy was out of the woods, we were seeing early and very nascent signs of recovery, came this big bank loot. And obviously it has had a collateral damage in terms of slow credit growth perhaps, or a credit freeze if I may, and overall business sentiment. How big will this damage really be, and what's the best possible way to tide over it? Naushad Forbes.
Well, in itself, it shouldn't affect good companies borrowing from good banks. And there are enough good banks and more than enough good companies in the country to borrow from them. It all depends on how we react to it. And what some of the knee-jerk reactions that we've seen in the immediate aftermath of the recent bank scandals are, I think, what are going to cause more trouble than anything else. So I think as long as we keep cool heads, as long as we don't try to demonstrate that we've done something, because what we may have done may not help at all in improving the actual issue because we're closing the door well after the horse is bolted, and instead it might cause damage to regular ongoing trade transactions. So I think we should just recognize that the banking scandal that happened has to be addressed as such. We need to go after and track down fraud and prosecute to the maximum extent permitted by law, and just focus on that issue and not try to then have to bring in a whole series of measures like cancelling LOUs and so on, which end up interfering with the normal way in which business is done.
Anand Narayan, you agree with that? That I think apart from the collateral damage that we will perhaps see if we do not have agile policy making, we will perhaps also see a lot of knee-jerk reactions, some of which Dr. Forbes did refer to, whether it's cancellation of LOUs or 50 crore worth of NPAs, going for forensic audits and all of that. Do you believe that's what this will entail now? We need to do this to be overly conscious, or do we run the risk of further jamming the system?
Let's look at the bigger picture beyond the knee-jerk reactions which Naushad rightly referred to. This isn't good news for the economy as a whole. Clearly you have multiple things going wrong with the banking system right now. Even prior to this PNB crisis and the other small frauds coming up, the NPAs, gross NPAs, where the stressed assets as a whole was over 11%, gross NPAs were close to 10 trillion rupees and growing. Plus, we've had the 12th February circular of the RBI, which now indicates that we'll probably see a lot more of NPAs coming out of the woodworks, indicating overall stress in the system. Now, what that's going to do is, again, jam the economy a bit. We already talked about the fact that demand is low and therefore investment on the private side is also kind of muted, which means that the heavy lifting which has to happen through either the fisc or through off-balance sheet fisc just goes up. Somebody has to put in the money for first the investment cycle to start and demand to come in, and that probably just increases the weight on a good government to come in and do things. So in the short run, this really isn't good news. At the same time, the old adage that don't let a good crisis go waste probably comes to the fore. The reality is there are core issues with the entire banking system. Public sector banks, while this has unfortunately become a debate about privatization versus non-privatization, I think the bigger immediate issue is giving autonomy to the public sector banks and giving the right incentive structures to the private sector, to the public sector banks. If we can address these two issues, I think we'll go a long way in making the most of this particular crisis and coming out maybe 2-3 years down the road in a much better shape than we are currently. I'm not a fan for a knee-jerk privatization as a panacea to what we have currently. But I do think autonomy and the right incentive structure, essentially unshackling the public sector bankers, and they're very, very talented people, from the shackles of North Block will go a long way in probably resolving issues in the long run. But yes, you're right, there is going to be pain in the short run. Undeniably, the economy, this isn't good news for the economy.
Okay, Ruben Abraham, I'm going to come to you because as far as tackling bad loans is concerned, we've seen a bit of a slugfest, a bit of a war of words, some very, not so polite things being said both on the part of the government and the RBI. Does this slugfest dampen sentiment further? And does this delay NPA resolution even more? Because you can't have the central bank says, I don't have enough authority, and the government shut them up by saying, actually you do, you haven't acted, and you failed on, regulation and supervision.
Yeah, so I am not an expert on banking at all, so I should really leave this question for the bankers, and especially I think Mira is probably much better placed to answer this question than I am.
So let me go across to her then. Okay, so let me go across to her on that note then. Ms. Sanyal, do you agree with me when I say that this slugfest between the government on one hand and, the RBI on the other is actually just leading to more vitiated sentiment? It's to nobody's good, and you still have India's regulators say they don't have enough authority, and the government snapped them by saying, actually you do, but you failed on supervision. Where does this lead us?
Well, Supriya, I think the real problem is that this is a mess. I mean, we have many problems in the banking system, and they are not recent problems. They have built up over a period of time. And I think we should separate the problem of the NPAs and the problems of the fraud, because not every NPA originated out of a fraudulent transaction, and not every fraud is turning into an NPA, and the distinction is important. But what they both point to is that there has been serious lack of governance both within the banks and within the regulatory system. What I do think is very important is that the point which you've pointed out, the Slugfest, is ugly, it's unnecessary, and it is stupid, because what it is doing is it is creating a crisis of confidence in the Indian banking system. I absolutely agree with Anant when he said there are many, many bankers in the public sector bank who are highly competent people of great integrity. Equally, I believe that the Reserve Bank of India has for years been one of the best central banks in the world. However, they have been overruled by the Ministry of Finance, by the Department of Banking Supervision, and we have seen, recently in terms of the whole demonetization exercise, what a badly executed and planned event that was. And it is, it's clear that the Reserve Bank of India, no governor can overrule the government. Perhaps we don't know what this governor's view on the matter was, but a previous governor has clearly stated that it was not a good idea and the government overruled it. Now the point is, where does the buck stop? And unfortunately in the Indian banking system, who does the head of a public sector bank report to? Does he listen to an official in the Ministry of Finance? Does he listen to the Reserve Bank of India? Does he listen to the nearest politician who gives him a call? And that is the root of a lot of these problems. There is no clarity in terms of what you are responsible for, who you are accountable to, and what your authority is. And this is the classic recipe for a disaster, which is pretty much what we have at the moment. The NPAs are very, very large. Some of them could be as a result of fraud.
Right.
Many of them are a result of mismanagement, lack of focus, a bad judgment, and some of them are just to do with the business cycle. So there are some risks which are inherent to banking, and
Right.
nobody can be blamed for that, because that is inherent in the business. But there are other things which are either due to poor
Right.
judgment, due to crony capitalism, due to interference, or due to sheer corruption and collusion. And this has to be fixed.
Right.
The question is, who is
Right.
going to do it? Who is going to take the accountability to do it? Because there's no shortage of recommendations. You've had the Narsimham Committee report, you've had the PJ Naik Committee
Right.
report, you now have the Kotak report. I mean, you
true,
have several.
true, yes.
In India, there's no short of recommendations. There's no shortage of recommendations. Who is going to, bell the cat?
Right.
Who is going to take
Right.
the action? That is the question.
Right. Fair point, and that's a very valid question indeed. Ruben, I want to come to you, and I specifically want to talk about the insolvency proceedings. I mean, that was introduced in a bid to make it easier for the banks and for us to deal with NPAs, reduce the mounting burden, have quick resolutions, and let projects become viable or find new management, new promoter. But on the ground, it seems we are heading to a plethora of litigation. I mean, every bid that has come in, every bidder has ended up in a court, it seems, at this point in time. And the whole idea of a resolution or quick resolution is obviously taking a back seat. And that has entailed and ignited this big debate on why this insolvency code itself needs some kind of tweaking, if not an overhaul. Are you someone who shares that view? And what sort of changes would you want to see?
I think you are throwing multiple curveballs my way on subjects that are far beyond my expertise. Unfortunately, again, insolvency is not something that I've looked at all. So you'll have to excuse me on this question.
Naushad Forbes, you want to come in on that, sir? The kind of changes one expects and one should be seeing on the insolvency code, because right now what we are risking is a plethora of litigation.
Well, just to pick up on Ruben's point, competence has never limited my willingness to talk. So I'll have a shot at your question. The comment that I would make is that these are early days in the actual implementation of the insolvency code, and I think in these early days you will see you will see these kinds of issues coming up that we need to address and then move on. I wouldn't be as negative about it. I think the actual Bankruptcy Act was a major reform, a major step forward for us as a country. Yes, the initial days are going to be somewhat messy as these kinds of issues get sorted out. One of the opinions that I've read, which seemed to make a lot of sense to me, was that the original proposal for the act had a tribunal built in instead of actually going to the courts to decide these kinds of implementation issues that are coming up at present. Maybe that's an idea that needs to be dusted off and looked at again, so that as these points come up, they can be easily addressed and resolved, and the process can move on. But I wouldn't yet declare failure on the entire act and code. I think it's early days, and I think we'll see it deliver very well over time as we sort these initial glitches out. So I would hold on before forming an opinion on whether or not it's going to deliver on its intentions.
I'm glad we have an eternal optimist in you, and we do hope things will smoothen out as far as this Insolvency Code is concerned. Plenty of hopes being pinned on that. But on that note, I'm going to take a really quick breather here on the India Development Debate. I'm back in a moment with this wonderful panel talking about an agenda of actionable business intelligence as we raise the curtains on the 4th edition of the India Economic Conclave by the Times Network. Welcome back. You're watching the India Development Debate. This is a special edition because we are putting the spotlight on curtains that will go up as far as the India Economic Conclave is concerned, the 4th edition organized by the Times Network, and we're trying to put together an agenda for actionable business intelligence. Ruben Abraham, I have thrown enough banking googlies at you, and I promise to throw no more. But I do want to talk about jobs because, everybody keeps referring to India's demographic dividend and all of that. But that demographic dividend will soon become a disaster if we don't create enough jobs. The reality is that artificial intelligence or machine learning and the fast pace of technology is displacing a lot of jobs as we know them. What needs to be done? I mean, how do we bridge the skill the skill deficit versus the jobs that are available, and how do we create jobs that will continue to be relevant?
Right. So I'll need a little bit of time to answer this. So first of all, on the demographic dividend question. So I think first of all, we need to introduce a little bit of nuance on that. So when we say India has this great demographic dividend, we need to break that down from India to the states. So when we look at the states, what we find is that the median age in a state like Tamil Nadu or Kerala is 30 or 31. The median age in a state like Bihar is 19, UP is 20. So, it's like the demographic dividend is actually concentrated in some states and not necessarily in others. So the problems of Kerala and Tamil Nadu may actually look quite different from the problems that UP and Bihar are about to face. So we need to necessarily parse those things out. Now, on the sort of larger jobs question, I think, look, no country has ever got rich without, or basically broken out of a poverty cycle without actually fundamentally going through 3 transitions. And the 3 transitions basically are farm to non-farm, rural to urban, and informal to formal. Now, one could argue with the introduction of GST, etc., the informal to formal is probably in motion. Clearly, the urbanization process is also underway. So these structural changes are happening, but if we actually could either speed it along or build the institutional infrastructure to manage that process better, I think that'll be super useful. Now, the institutional infrastructure, several people have raised this issue, but let me pinpoint on that, because I think there is, when we talk about growth in India and India $10 trillion economy, there is just no getting around the fact that we cannot get there unless we have administrative reforms, judicial reforms, police reforms. These fundamental governance reforms are vitally necessary to enable these transitions to happen so that we can actually create the sort of jobs that we have to create. Now, on the last point that you raised about AI and machine learning and so on, I think the good news is that Indian wages today are still low enough that at least for the next 15 years odd, we will not face the sort of threat that other more advanced economies actually face. But that 15 to 20 years is the window that we have to basically get a process going by which the surplus labor in agriculture, and there's a lot of surplus labor in agriculture because agriculture employs about 49% of the population, produces 13% of GDP. So that surplus population basically needs to be absorbed elsewhere. And hopefully that will be absorbed into low-skill manufacturing and the like. And for that to take off, we go back to the very first question that we started with, which is that we dramatically need to improve the ease of doing business for small and medium sector firms, because that is where employment will come from.
That's putting it very well, and that gives us hope that perhaps we will be able to get there. And I think jobs is such an important issue, impacts each one of us, impacts the Indians that we've all been speaking about, and I think there needs to be something done on a war footage. But that's putting it very well there. I just want to talk about some of the other things before we end this show. And Ananda Ryan, if I may come to you, one of the things that was cleared by the government today is 76% stake sale in Air India, and who would have thought that privatization of the national carrier will be a reality? A, how hopeful are you of that happening in the term of this government? And B, do you believe in some sense this is as big as the GST, the privatization, the intention of the government to get out of sectors or businesses that they have no business to be in?
Oh, absolutely. I think this would be very positive, but it's a small start. I mean, there's plenty of stuff that still needs to be out of the hands of the government. And banking is a big area of, it's a big elephant in the room that we keep talking about. But going back to the original slogan, which is minimum government, maximum governance, it has to be about that. Our resources are scarce and our people are talented enough to manage, the non-essential parts of the economy. What the government has to focus on is getting the basic infrastructure right, which is empowering education, healthcare, nutrition, and getting the governance structure in place so that the population, which is now empowered, now on an equal footing, able to come out and solve India's problems by themselves. When you talk about artificial intelligence and all the challenges coming up, this is not going to be solved by North Bloc. What North Bloc can do, or what the government can do, both central and state, is enable the population by giving them basic infrastructure, basic healthcare, education, and then our ingenuity, our hard work, our social structure is good enough for us to see through whatever issues is thrown towards us. So this is a small step towards that, Air India, and I think hopefully there's many more to come. If you'll indulge me for a second, Supriya, on the other issue which you brought up, which is of trade wars, I have two quick points to make. One, I'm a little more hopeful than the rest of the world that this trade war business nonsense will, wash over pretty quickly. It's all, after all, about populism and Mr. Trump trying to look good for his own domestic population. I think there's just too much at stake for people to go and cross the brink. And, you cannot have the global economy collapse now. It's in nobody's interest, and definitely not in Mr. Trump's interest. Having said that, there will be short-term pain, and I think there is pain coming up for India. On specifically one count which we should be careful about. There's a US Treasury report which is going to come out on the trade practices, on the currency practices of its big trading partners. India is likely going to hit two of the three indicators that the US Treasury watches, which is our trade surplus with the US is over $20 billion. And it's possible that the RBI has intervened to the extent of more than 2% of GDP in the last few months and bought dollars. On both these counts, therefore, we could get named as a currency manipulator, which is actually ridiculous given the size of our current account deficit overall. But nevertheless, that's not going to be good news in the eyes of a populist Trump administration. And we could see pain towards us, specifically from the US, in the short term, before things settle down and become normalized.
Right. Well, that's an important point, because, we can't be clubbed as a currency manipulator with our neighbors there in China. But I think that's an important thing that we'll have to keep our eyes on as far as there's US Treasury report is concerned. But Naushad Forbes, Dr. Forbes, coming to you. We are obviously in the last 1 year of this government's tenure. We are going to head into elections. There are big state assembly elections coming up, and crucial ones at that. Do you anticipate, do you fear, do you see political compulsions hijack the economic agenda?
Well, what I hope we will see emerge is things that would actually influence and improve the lives of millions of people with some clear messaging around those areas. And let me pick an area that was talked about earlier on, which is investments in education. If there is one issue that would be really fundamental for us as a country going forward to take advantage of the demographic dividend, etc., it's to really build our own human capital. And there's great understanding about what needs to be done to improve the education system. There are different things that we need to do for primary, for secondary, and for higher education. For primary education, we need to do some very basic things in terms of ensuring just the teachers show up, ensuring minimum standards of quality in existing schools. For secondary education, we need to address the size of schools, have larger schools such that you can have more specialized teachers, larger classes in each group that can improve the quality outcomes quite dramatically. And for higher education, especially for professional higher education, the government needs to get out of the way in terms of regulating what fees are charged and so on, and then leave it to many of the private providers with transparency to actually provide education to willing buyers, to willing investors in education, parents and so on, who can then borrow from banks. So there are some really clear ideas that can be done. I think many of these kinds of areas, like higher education, can be very popular as well. And if we can somehow see a political debate emerging around things that will be popular, that could be very powerful for us as a country. Popular things, if you start seeing the Congress and BJP arguing about how's the best way of actually improving the quality of primary and secondary schools in the country, that to me would be a really valuable, useful thing, and we should keep pushing them in that direction.
Exactly. I think what is going to be even more useful is if the main opposition, the Congress and the BJP, begin talking to each other, which is why it's a pertinent question that I want to put forward to Meera Sanyal. And Ms. Sanyal, the trust deficit or the animosity levels that we are seeing between this government and the opposition parties is perhaps unprecedented. And this does take a toll on the economy. This does take a toll on economic decisions, does it not?
Well, absolutely, Supriya. And, I think there can be no more telling indication than what happened with the finance bill, which was passed without any debate in Parliament. And Parliament itself has been non-functional. But, to a larger point, I think it was a very famous economist who said that you need nothing more than peace, law and order, and low taxes for an economy to prosper. I think there is really a fundamental issue in India today that there is an atmosphere of fear. There is a sense of distrust, not just between political parties, but between people and the institutions, between people and media. There's a very, very sharp polarization which is taking place. And I think it is incumbent on the government, but also on all of us to set this right, because India is not now a very pleasant place to live in. There's so many differences, there's so much animosity, not just between, as I said, political parties, but between groups of people. Farmers are unhappy, students are unhappy. It's taking the form of people committing suicide, of people being killed, of journalists being killed. This is not a healthy environment. These are not enabling circumstances for people to feel that they're living in a peaceful society where there is law and order, where they can get along with their business. I think it is very, very important that the government sets that right. And this starts at the top, Supriya. This really is a question of some very clear messaging from the senior most leaders in this country that what is being going on has to stop.
Talking about those messaging, I think you've really put the nail on its, hit the nail on its head. Rashesh Shah, the last word you then. Consistency and continuity of policies is obviously very crucial to making India an attractive destination for doing business, driving more investments. What's your message to the political class to leave aside their differences, and how do they put India first? Very briefly, I've got the last 1.5 minutes on the show there.
You're absolutely right, and it's not just for the political class. I think it's for everybody. One of the biggest problem Indian investors, Indian businessmen, global investment, global businessmen all find in India is this one word called unpredictability. India is seen as a very unpredictable country. Everybody acknowledges India is a great market. Our growth rate is huge. We are in the stage of compounding of growth, which makes it very exciting for most players in India. But what they get very troubled with is the unpredictability of outcomes in India. And it's not just the politicians, it's the lawmakers, it's the regulators, it's the courts, it's the entire system in India. There are too many pulls and pressures, there is too much uncertainty around outcomes, and people get unnerved. Any businessman anywhere in the world will think twice before investing if there is a lot of unpredictability on the outcome. So one of the things we need to do is become truly a very rule-based society, a rule-based economy where outcomes can be predictable. The more uncertainty you attach, the more the risk premium that goes up in the economy, which ultimately adds up to the cost.
All right, on that very predictable note, I've completely run out of time here, but I can't thank this wonderful panel enough. Rashesh Shah, Naushad Forbes, Meera Sanyal, Anant Narayan, and of course Ruben Abraham for putting it all in perspective and helping us stitch together an agenda for actionable business intelligence. That's exactly what we're looking at doing at the 2-day India Economic Conclave, its 4th edition, and we'll keep you updated with the biggest and the best voices from the world of policy making, business, and of course opinion makers and thought leaders from here and across the world. Thanks very much for being with us in this edition of the India Development Debate. Up next is Top 10 with Tanya Bhardwaj.